The air is heavy with candle smoke and you find yourself inside a nursery that doesn't feel like a nursery at all. It feels more like a sick room. The child lying in the ornate cradle is not robust, not the picture of princely health you might expect for the heir of a great kingdom. His cheeks are pale, his frame frail, and every cough echoes like a prophecy of doom. This is Ferdinand, the boy who will grow into Spain's most infamous king, a man remembered not for glory or conquest, but for something darker, stranger, and far more unsettling. His earliest years are marked not by tender lullabies, but by whispers of inadequacy, doubts about his strength, and superstitions that cling to his body like shadows. And here's the blunt truth: you probably won't survive this journey into his life with your innocence intact. His story is a labyrinth of humiliation and cruelty, more grotesque than regal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is on your clock right now. I love picturing all of you scattered across the globe, sharing this eerie midnight walk together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. From the start, Ferdinand is different. Born in 1784 as the son of Charles IV of Spain and the notorious Maria Louisa of Parma, he isn't surrounded by warmth. Instead, you see a court buzzing with rumours that he is sickly, slow and ill-suited for rule. Historians still argue whether those early stories were exaggerated by political enemies or whether Ferdinand truly was as weak and awkward as described. Either way, the damage is done. From infancy, he grows up with a sense of being less than, a defective heir to a crumbling empire. Imagine being told your whole life that you are both the future of Spain and a disappointment to it at the same time. That's enough to twist anyone's mind. The palace walls are alive with gossip. Ferdinand is mocked for his appearance, for his clumsy manner, and even for the way he speaks. Courtiers describe him as dull, almost incapable of conversation, and yet his eyes, when he fixes them on someone, burn with resentment. You feel the unease in the air. Here is a boy who takes every slight to heart, storing it like a coin in a box, ready to be spent later in the currency of cruelty. And while other royal children play at swords or pose for paintings, Ferdinand retreats inward, comforted only by fantasies of power he cannot yet grasp. There's a fringe tidbit often whispered about his early life. Maria Louisa, his mother, was said to have openly favoured her lovers over her son, letting Ferdinand stew in neglect. Whether or not that's entirely true, you sense the alienation shaping him, teaching him early that intimacy means humiliation. He learns that love is unreliable, that trust is dangerous, and that the only safe ground is bitterness. By the time he reaches adolescence, Ferdinand is already infamous within his own household for his awkwardness with women. While his peers joke, flirt, and test their budding charms, he stands stiff and embarrassed, watching from the shadows. The Spanish court, steeped in Catholic morality and endless ceremonies, becomes a crucible of pressure. Every time Ferdinand stumbles over words or blushes in front of a lady, it's another reminder of how unsuited he seems for the dynastic role of producing heirs. You begin to see how this boy, pressured, ridiculed, and cornered, might later turn obsession with virginity and control into grotesque rituals. Historians still debate whether his personality was more shaped by genetics, environment, or sheer paranoia. Was Ferdinand doomed from birth, or did the cruelty of others mould him into the king he became? You'll never know for certain, but standing here, candlelight flickering on those pale cheeks, you can almost feel the answer pressing in. Sometimes it only takes one sickly childhood to ruin a whole kingdom. You wander deeper into the palace, and it doesn't take long to see that Ferdinand's childhood wasn't simply sickly, it was cruel by design. The court of Charles IV is less a royal family home and more a stage for ridicule. Tutors tasked with shaping young Ferdinand into a monarch treat him instead as a target. When he struggles with Latin or stumbles through etiquette, laughter ripples through the chamber. His father, Charles IV, is a man better suited for hunting than ruling, and he treats his son's inadequacies with impatience. You stand in the corner of a gilded hall and watch the boy shrink smaller every time his father's voice rises in anger. It isn't discipline, it's humiliation. Maria Louisa of Parma, Ferdinand's mother, hardly softens the blow. Known for her domineering personality and notorious affairs, she is said to have delighted in belittling her son, calling him clumsy and useless even in front of servants. Some accounts even suggest she paraded her lovers openly, letting Ferdinand stew in shame. Historians still argue whether these reports came from gossip mongers hostile to her, or whether they reveal the toxic stew of Ferdinand's upbringing. What you do know is this: every insult hardens his bitterness. Every sneer etches another line of cruelty into his character. Imagine being a child whose every failure is amplified, whose own family laughs when he falters. You would either collapse under the weight of it or build armour made of spite. Ferdinand chooses the latter. He becomes wary, paranoid, and obsessively secretive. While other princes learn how to wield charm, he perfects the art of sulking silence, staring daggers at anyone who mocks him. You can almost hear him thinking, "One day when I am king, you will all regret this." There's a quirky tidbit hidden in these palace years. Ferdinand reportedly developed a habit of retreating to his chambers for hours at a time, surrounding himself with religious images and devotional trinkets, as though holiness could compensate for humiliation. It wasn't genuine piety so much as a shield, a way to make himself appear virtuous against the corruption of his parents. Courtiers noticed the performance, whispering that he was sanctimonious rather than spiritual. And yet this facade of holiness later became one of his political weapons, an awkward boy reinventing himself as God's chosen defender. The cruelty doesn't stop with family. Courtiers see the heir's vulnerability and exploit it. They whisper about his looks, his stunted social graces, and his supposed impotence, long before his first marriage even proves or disproves the rumours. Whether the rumours are true hardly matters. What matters is that Ferdinand hears them, absorbs them, and begins to fixate on the very idea of sexual adequacy. This obsession will haunt him, twisting into bizarre bedroom rituals when he finally wields the crown. You glance at him now, a teenager sulking in the shadows of Madrid's Escorial Palace, glaring at portraits of ancestors who radiate the power and virility he knows he lacks. He is surrounded by reminders of failure, even as he dreams of revenge. And the more his tutors punish him, the more his father shouts, the more his mother sneers, the more he clings to one desperate thought. When he becomes king, he will not be mocked. He will make others suffer instead. Historians still debate how much of Ferdinand's cruelty later in life can be traced back to these early years. Was he simply a bad seed, rotten from the start? Or was he shaped, moulded like soft wax by constant humiliation? Standing here in the echoing halls of his boyhood, with the air thick with ridicule and disdain, you begin to suspect the answer. You don't need a crystal ball to see it. Cruelty doesn't appear out of nowhere. It festers, it feeds, it grows, and in Ferdinand's case it would one day devour a whole kingdom. You drift now into the perfumed corridors where dynastic marriages are arranged like chess moves, and Ferdinand is suddenly no longer just a humiliated boy, he's a pawn. Spain's survival depends on alliances, and so his personal insecurities get paraded on an international stage. You can almost hear the whispers as diplomats size him up, thin, awkward, uncertain, and far from the dazzling princes of France or Austria. Yet he carries the weight of a collapsing empire on his shoulders. Spain needs heirs, and fast. Ferdinand, however, is already terrified of the bedroom. The first attempt is Maria Antonia of Naples, daughter of Ferdinand IV of Naples and Marie Caroline, sister to the famous Marie Antoinette. On paper, the match is golden, uniting Spain with Naples against France. In practice, it's a disaster. Ferdinand, stiff and paranoid, greets his bride with suspicion, while Maria Antonia, fiery and sharp, mocks his nervousness. The court soon fills with gossip that the marriage is unconsummated, that Ferdinand is incapable of performing even his most basic duty as husband and prince. Historians still argue whether those rumours were malicious propaganda spread by his enemies, or whether his own deep insecurities truly left him impotent. In the candlelit chambers of the royal palace, the tension grows unbearable. Imagine being Maria Antonia, a young queen trapped in a gilded cage, expected to produce heirs with a man who avoids her touch and recoils from intimacy. Physicians are summoned, remedies whispered and prayers offered, but nothing changes. Ferdinand grows more paranoid, convinced his wife is laughing at him behind closed doors. Whether she did or not hardly matters, he feels humiliated, and humiliation for Ferdinand always festers into cruelty. There's a quirky tidbit buried in the chronicles. Maria Antonia was rumoured to have insulted him by calling him El Rey de Baston, the king of the walking stick, hinting at his constant need for support and, by implication, his lack of virility. True or not, the nickname circulates in the court like wildfire. You can almost hear the suppressed chuckles behind fans and folded sleeves. Ferdinand hears them too, and with every whisper, his obsession with sexual adequacy deepens into a lifelong paranoia. Diplomacy doesn't care about personal dysfunction, though. Spain tries to push forward with the heirs, while Ferdinand hides behind excuses. He blames Maria Antonia for their childlessness, even suggesting she may be cursed or poisoned. When she dies young, officially of tuberculosis, though rumours swirl of foul play, the court divides. Some mourn her, others breathe relief, but Ferdinand carries away one lesson. Women are dangerous, humiliating, and never to be trusted. The dynastic carousel doesn't stop. Plans for remarriage begin almost immediately, with Europe treating Ferdinand less like a man and more like breeding stock. The irony, of course, is that the very thing required of him, fertility, is the one thing he fears he cannot provide. As negotiations with new royal families falter, whispers return. Spain's future king might not be able to father heirs at all. Historians still debate whether these rumours were exaggerated to undermine him, or whether his later medical conditions give them weight. Either way, the damage is permanent. You linger in those corridors, listening to diplomats mutter about bloodlines, while servants giggle behind curtains. For Ferdinand, marriage is not a partnership, not even a political formality. It's a stage where his private failures are public spectacle. Each attempt to wed is another round of humiliation, another chisel against his fragile ego. By now, you can sense where this story is heading. When such a man eventually gains absolute power, he will not seek love or companionship, he will seek domination, and he will twist the very idea of marriage into something cruel and grotesque. And so the pawn moves across the board, clumsy and resentful, awaiting the day he becomes king. Spain may call him Ferdinand the Desired in hopes of rallying the people, but inside the royal bedchamber he is Ferdinand the Humiliated. And humiliation, as you've already seen, is the seed of everything dark that follows. You follow Ferdinand out of Madrid and into the stormy years when Europe itself is cracking apart. Napoleon looms large over the continent, swallowing kingdoms and planting brothers on thrones as if they were pieces on a game board. Spain, fragile and divided, becomes his next target. And here is Ferdinand, desperate not for glory or independence, but for validation. You trail him to Bayonne in 1808, where one of the strangest royal humiliations in history unfolds. The scene is surreal. Imagine a royal family so dysfunctional that both father and son actually beg Napoleon to recognise them. Charles IV, furious with Ferdinand for scheming against him, abdicates in favour of his son, but then Charles changes his mind and appeals to Napoleon, saying he was forced. Ferdinand, equally desperate, rushes to Napoleon with his own plea: "Make me king, not my father." You stand at the edge of this farce, watching two grown men squabble like children, while Napoleon, amused and calculating, plays them both. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand was naive or complicit, but what's undeniable is that he walked willingly into a trap. In Bayonne, Napoleon summons the entire family under the guise of negotiation. What unfolds is less negotiation and more surrender. Both Charles IV and Ferdinand VII are pressured to renounce their claims, handing Spain over to Napoleon's brother Joseph. Ferdinand, who thought he might charm the French emperor into backing his cause, finds himself stripped of even the illusion of power. The Spanish people, horrified, dub the debacle the abdications of Bayonne. For Ferdinand, it is a humiliation so public and so searing that he will never forgive the world for witnessing it. There's a quirky tidbit worth pausing on. During his brief reign before Bayonne, Ferdinand issued decrees as if he were already king, some of them so petty and vindictive they read more like schoolyard revenge than royal policy. One order, for example, reinstated his favourite courtiers while purging anyone loyal to his parents. Imagine a man so consumed with resentment that even with a nation on the brink of collapse, his priority is getting back at old enemies. It tells you everything about his character. And yet despite this disaster, Ferdinand's reputation among the common people doesn't die. While Napoleon installs Joseph Bonaparte, Spaniards rise in bloody revolt, sparking the Peninsular War. To them, Ferdinand becomes a symbol not of leadership or competence, but of resistance against French occupation. They call him El Deseado, the desired one, projecting onto him all their hopes for freedom. The irony is painful. While peasants and guerrillas die fighting for Spain's independence, Ferdinand lounges in French captivity, more worried about his dignity than his country's suffering. Historians still debate how complicit Ferdinand was in his own downfall. Did he truly believe Napoleon would make him a respected monarch? Or was he simply so desperate for approval that he ignored every warning? Whatever the case, his stay in Bayonne cements his paranoia. From this point forward, Ferdinand is convinced that betrayal lurks everywhere, in his family, in his court, and especially among the women he's forced to marry. As you watch him leave Bayonne, stripped of his crown and sneered at by Europe, you can almost feel the bitterness calcify in his bones. He will never forget the mockery, never forgive the humiliation, and when years later he claws his way back to the throne, he will unleash that bitterness not on Napoleon, not on his enemies, but on his own people and his own wives. Because Ferdinand's story isn't about redemption, it's about a man who, once broken, chooses to break everything around him in return. You walk among the cheering crowds of Madrid in 1814, the air alive with shouts of Viva el Rey, and yet, beneath the confetti and ringing church bells, you feel something off. Ferdinand has returned from captivity, and the people, exhausted by war, hail him as the long-lost saviour, the desired one at last. They imagine a liberator, a king who will reward their loyalty with freedom and stability. But as you watch him dismount his carriage, that familiar bitterness flickers in his eyes. He isn't here to heal Spain, he's here to settle scores. Within weeks, the mask falls. Ferdinand tears up the liberal constitution of 1812, the so-called Constitución de Cádiz, which had promised representation and modern rights. Instead, he restores absolute monarchy, dragging Spain backward into repression. He jails reformers, censors the press, and reinstates the Inquisition. You can almost hear the collective gasp of those same people who shouted his name with joy, now realising they'd cheered for their own jailer. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's reactionary policies came from personal conviction or simple spite against anyone who dared to rule in his absence. Either way, the effect is the same. Spain is smothered under the weight of his paranoia. Step into his court and you'll feel the atmosphere shift. Ministers walk on eggshells, courtiers flatter excessively, and whispers of dissent vanish into dungeons. Ferdinand delights in reminding everyone who mocked him before that he now holds the whip. Imagine a man who has been laughed at his whole life suddenly handed absolute power. It's not justice he seeks, but revenge. The cruelty once directed at him now flows outward like a poisoned river. There's a quirky tidbit buried in the archives. Ferdinand reportedly kept a list of names, courtiers, ministers, even of family members, who had insulted him or supported his rivals during the Bayonne years. Upon his return, he began crossing them off one by one, stripping titles, confiscating estates, or ordering imprisonment. It's less the behaviour of a monarch, and more the vendetta of a schoolboy with too much power. But in Ferdinand's Spain, childish grudges become national policy. The repression isn't limited to politics. You notice how it creeps into his personal relationships, especially with women. Having been humiliated in his marriages and mocked for his inadequacies, Ferdinand now wields his crown as a shield and a cudgel. Queens and mistresses alike are treated less as companions and more as objects to be dominated. His court becomes notorious for its atmosphere of suspicion, where women are monitored, gossiped about, and punished for imagined betrayals. You can almost hear the echo of his childhood shame fueling every cruel decision. If he cannot command respect in the bedroom, he will force obedience everywhere else. And yet, despite the suffocating fear he spreads, some Spaniards still cling to him. They whisper that perhaps repression is necessary to heal the wounds of war, that a strong hand will stabilise the kingdom. But you, watching from the shadows of the throne room, see the truth more clearly. This isn't stability. It's Ferdinand replaying his own humiliations on a national scale. The boy who was mocked in his nursery, scorned by his bride and ridiculed in Bayonne is now taking his revenge, one decree, one imprisonment, one ruined life at a time. Historians still debate whether Ferdinand ever truly believed he was Spain's saviour, or whether he revelled only in being feared. Standing here, surrounded by silenced voices and trembling courtiers, you can feel the answer pressing against your chest. Ferdinand hasn't returned as a hero. He has returned as the monster king, one whose reign would scar Spain for generations. You linger now in the royal chambers, where politics and private life blur into one suffocating theatre of control. Ferdinand, newly restored as Spain's absolute ruler, views women not as partners but as instruments, both for his ego and for the dynastic mission of producing an heir. Every marriage he enters feels less like a union and more like an experiment, as though queens were being tested in a grim laboratory, and you stand nearby watching as each attempt ends in humiliation, frustration, and cruelty. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, is long gone, dead young and surrounded by rumours. Now Ferdinand's court arranges a second marriage, this time to Isabel of Braganza, a Portuguese princess chosen to solidify ties between the two Iberian crowns. Isabel arrives with hope, beauty and diplomatic weight, but almost immediately she finds herself trapped in the same cycle of Ferdinand's paranoia. The king treats her not with affection but with suspicion. He demands loyalty, obedience and silence while offering only coldness in return. You can almost feel the chill between them in the vast, candle-lit palace halls. Isabel's life becomes a performance for the court. When she fails to conceive quickly, whispers circulate about her fertility, though everyone knows the real problem may lie elsewhere. Physicians and midwives are dragged into the king's chambers, ordered to examine, to test, to diagnose. Not him, never him, but her. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's inability to produce heirs was biological or psychological, but his obsession with blaming his wives never wavers. In his eyes, the women are always the defect, never himself. There's a fringe tidbit that paints the picture even more vividly. Ferdinand was said to have insisted on keeping close track of his wives' physical conditions, monitoring their cycles and ordering attendants to record details in ways that feel more like livestock management than marriage. Imagine being a queen reduced to a calendar entry, every aspect of your body scrutinised by a husband who cannot bear his own inadequacies. When Isabel dies suddenly in childbirth in 1818, delivering a stillborn son, rumours spread like wildfire. Some whisper of negligence, others of sheer bad luck, but many note that Ferdinand seemed more preoccupied with how the tragedy reflected on his legacy than with the loss of his wife. You can almost hear him brooding, tallying up another failure, another humiliation to add to the pile. And instead of softening him, the loss hardens him further. He marries again, this time to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a girl barely 16 when she becomes Queen of Spain. If Isabel's marriage was cold, Maria Josepha's is downright bizarre. Deeply pious and raised in convent-like seclusion, she is horrified by the marital expectations suddenly thrust upon her. Ferdinand, for his part, is equally anxious, so much so that the union goes unconsummated for months. Imagine the tension in those palace walls, courtiers speculating, physicians whispering, and the queen herself begging to be spared duties she fears are sinful. Historians still argue about how long this strange situation lasted, but one thing is clear. Ferdinand's obsession with control and purity would turn this child bride's life into a waking nightmare. And so you see the pattern repeating, arranged marriages designed for power, but twisted by a man incapable of intimacy and consumed by paranoia. Ferdinand doesn't love, he surveils. He doesn't trust, he tests. He doesn't partner, he punishes. To him, women are property, possessions meant to heal his ego and secure his dynasty. But instead, each queen who walks into his orbit is ground down, reduced to another piece of evidence in the trial of his own insecurities. You stand in the dim corridors of the palace, and you can feel the weight of it pressing in. These marriages aren't about unity or legacy. They're about Ferdinand reliving his humiliations and transferring the pain. Spain may call him king, but in these chambers, he is nothing more than a man staging experiments on women, desperate to prove what he can never quite achieve. You remain in the dimly lit palace, but now your focus sharpens on Ferdinand's most disturbing fixation, virginity. It isn't simply a moral value for him, or even a dynastic requirement. It becomes an obsession, a ritual, a grotesque performance staged at the intersection of his paranoia and his power. Every marriage he enters begins not with affection or celebration, but with an inspection, a cold verification of purity. You watch as physicians, attendants, and priests are summoned into chambers that should have been private, and instead turn into a stage where a bride's body is treated like evidence in a trial. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, his third wife, becomes the most tragic victim of this ritualized humiliation. Barely out of childhood, she is raised in a cloister, steeped in Catholic teachings about chastity and sin. On her wedding night, instead of warmth or tenderness, she is met with fear and ceremony. Ferdinand, racked by insecurity, demands that she be examined to prove her virginity before the marriage can proceed. Imagine the horror of standing before strangers, your worth reduced to a single invasive verdict. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand insisted on these inspections personally or whether zealous courtiers encouraged them, but the result is the same. Marriage becomes less a union and more a clinical ordeal. What follows is no less bizarre. For months, Maria Josepha resists consummation, terrified that physical intimacy is sinful. Ferdinand, equally anxious, lets the stalemate drag on. Court gossip runs wild, with nobles whispering that the Queen still lives untouched, that the king is too inept or too fearful to complete his duty. It is said that Ferdinand even sought permission from the Pope to assure Maria Josepha that marital relations were not a mortal sin, a papal intervention in the royal bedroom. The very idea feels almost absurd, but in Ferdinand's world, absurdity and cruelty go hand in hand. There's a quirky tidbit nestled in these stories. Supposedly, when the Pope's permission arrived, Maria Josepha wept with relief, while Ferdinand strutted about as if papal endorsement of his bedroom activities were the crowning glory of his reign. You can almost picture him boasting, though the truth, that the union produced no heirs, would remain a festering wound. And still his fixation deepens. Ferdinand comes to equate virginity with control. Each new bride must be inspected, each rumour of infidelity or impurity investigated with almost inquisitorial zeal. For him, the proof of chastity isn't about faithfulness or sanctity. It's about eliminating the possibility that anyone might laugh at him again. If his queen is untouched, then no one can accuse him of inadequacy. If she is verified, then humiliation, his greatest fear, can be kept at bay. But imagine being one of these women, a queen in name, yet treated like property on a butcher's block, your most intimate self dissected and recorded in the name of dynastic purity. You hear the murmurs of courtiers outside, the scribbling of notes, the cold calculations of whether your body will redeem Spain's lineage or doom it further. It isn't love, it isn't even marriage, it is Ferdinand replaying his childhood humiliations on the women closest to him, cloaking cruelty in the language of morality. Historians still debate how much of this obsession stemmed from genuine religious fervour, and how much was born of Ferdinand's personal insecurities. Was he truly convinced he was defending Catholic purity, or was he merely building walls to protect his fragile ego? Standing in that suffocating chamber, with candlelight reflecting on anxious faces and terrified eyes, you realise the answer may be both. Religion gave him the excuse, but humiliation gave him the need. And together they forged one of the most unsettling rituals ever performed in a royal court. You drift further into the palace, past the whispering servants and shuttered windows, and the obsession with heirs grows louder than ever. For Ferdinand, the crown weighs not only with power, but with panic. The Spanish Bourbons are teetering, and without a legitimate son, his dynasty might collapse. Every failed pregnancy, every miscarriage, every barren union feels to him like another public humiliation. And so he clings to bizarre remedies, courtly superstitions and whispered medical tricks, grasping at anything that might give him the heir he so desperately desires. With Maria Josepha Amalia, no children come, and time keeps slipping away. Ferdinand grows restless, snapping at courtiers, blaming fate, blaming women, never himself. He orders more examinations, consults with physicians who recommend questionable tonics, and even entertains the possibility that witchcraft or curses might be at play. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand genuinely believed in these superstitions, or whether he simply used them as excuses to shift blame. Either way, his desperation turns the royal court into a carnival of quack remedies and holy relics. You can almost smell the strange concoctions, herbal brews spiked with questionable powders, aphrodisiac potions whispered about by court healers, even charms blessed by priests and tucked beneath the royal mattress. Ferdinand clings to each one as if it were the key to salvation. A quirky tidbit survives in rumour. He was said to have worn talismans and medals inscribed with prayers for fertility, convinced that these trinkets might succeed where flesh and willpower had failed. You picture him fumbling with them, a king reduced to a nervous child clutching toys for comfort. Meanwhile, the kingdom itself suffers. Wars, uprisings, and economic collapse rage outside the palace walls, but Ferdinand is fixated inward, consumed not by governance but by reproduction. Every failure in the royal bedroom reverberates outward as another political crisis. Without an heir, succession becomes uncertain, and with uncertainty comes rebellion. The irony is sharp. While Ferdinand obsesses over his private inadequacies, Spain itself bleeds. Then Maria Josefa dies young in 1829, leaving no children and leaving Ferdinand in despair, but also renewed determination. Within months, he remarries, this time to his own niece, Maria Cristina of Naples. The urgency is palpable, there is no time to waste, no shame in the family tree twisting in on itself. You can almost hear the gasps of scandalized observers. A decaying king marrying a girl decades his junior, his desperation for an heir overriding every boundary of propriety. Yet Ferdinand presses forward, convinced that only through her can his bloodline endure. The rituals of virginity inspection repeat, the paranoia repeats, the whispered prayers repeat, but this time something shifts. Maria Cristina conceives, and for the first time in his life, Ferdinand tastes what feels like victory. But it's a partial triumph. The child is not the son he longs for, but a daughter, Isabella. And so begins another round of fear, another round of scheming. He clings to her as his legacy, but knows too well that Spain may not accept a female heir without challenge. Historians still debate whether Ferdinand's desperation was driven by genuine devotion to his dynasty, or by the fear of personal failure. Was he trying to save Spain, or was he trying to prove, even in his final years, that he was not the object of ridicule everyone claimed? Watching him shuffle through the palace halls, clutching relics in one hand and court decrees in the other, you realise the answer doesn't matter. What matters is the image, a king haunted by his own inadequacies, trying to birth a dynasty out of superstition and cruelty, while his kingdom slips further into ruin. You stand now in the shadow of Ferdinand's final, strangest marriage, the one that ties his personal desperation directly to Spain's future. It is 1829, and the king, bloated, sickly, and visibly decaying, takes as his bride Maria Cristina of Naples, his own niece. The match scandalizes Europe, but Ferdinand doesn't care. He isn't chasing affection, he's chasing an heir. Every other marriage has ended in failure, humiliation, or death. Maria Cristina is his last chance, and the urgency oozes from every gesture, every decree, every forced smile at their wedding feast. Maria Cristina, barely in her 20s, steps into this role with cautious grace. You can almost feel her dread as she walks the palace corridors, shadowed by the memory of his previous wives who left no children or left only tragedy. She knows her fate is to endure him, to submit to the humiliating inspections and rituals he demands, to become little more than a vessel for his dynastic desperation. And yet, she also carries something Ferdinand never expected: resilience. Unlike the pious Maria Josefa, who shrank from intimacy, Maria Cristina steels herself. She understands that survival means compliance, but also cunning. Ferdinand, for all his cruelty, grows increasingly weak. Disease gnaws at him, leaving him swollen, exhausted, and often bedridden. The grotesque irony is that while his body collapses, his obsession with producing an heir only intensifies. Physicians rush in and out of his chambers, holy relics pile up by his bedside. And Maria Cristina is scrutinized at every turn. Historians still argue whether her eventual pregnancy was celebrated with genuine joy by Ferdinand or simply with the relief of a man clinging to legacy. When she delivers a child, Isabella, born in 1830, the palace erupts. At last, the Bourbon line has an heir, but not the son Ferdinand had hoped for, a daughter. And suddenly the question of succession becomes volatile. Spain has long resisted female rulers, and powerful factions begin to circle, eager to challenge Isabella's legitimacy. You can almost hear the political knives sharpening. Ferdinand, however, is determined. He issues the pragmatic sanction, overturning old laws of male preference succession, and declares that his daughter will reign after him. It's an act both desperate and defiant. He may not have the son he craved, but his bloodline will endure through her. There's a quirky tidbit worth pausing on. When Isabella was born, Ferdinand reportedly wept, clutching the infant with trembling hands, boasting that she was his greatest triumph. Yet behind those tears you sense another truth, relief that at last no one could deny he had produced an heir, even if the wrong sex. He parades her as proof of his virility, ignoring the irony that his reign had been one long performance of inadequacy. Maria Cristina, meanwhile, grows into her role not just as wife but as survivor. She begins quietly gathering allies, sensing that her husband's death will leave her in a precarious regency. While Ferdinand clings to Isabella as a symbol, Maria Cristina prepares for the brutal political storm to come. You can almost see her eyes scanning the court, calculating every alliance, every betrayal, even as she endures the king's decline. Historians still debate whether Maria Cristina pitied Ferdinand or despised him. Was she dutiful out of loyalty, or simply pragmatic in protecting her daughter's inheritance? You may never know for sure. What is certain is that Ferdinand's final years with her are a grotesque spectacle, a rotting king desperate for validation, and a young queen manoeuvring quietly behind the scenes to ensure that his decay does not drag her down with him. And so in these final days you witness the culmination of Ferdinand's life. He has achieved the heir he obsessed over, but at the cost of dignity, affection and stability. Spain teeters on the brink of civil war, courtiers whisper of Carlist claimants, and the legacy of humiliation he carried from cradle to crown is now written into the very future of his dynasty. You find yourself in the suffocating gloom of Ferdinand's final days, and the sight is pitiful. The king, once the desired one, now lies bloated, his body ravaged by gout, obesity and dropsy. His legs are swollen, his face distorted, and attendants whisper that the smell of decay clings to him even before death claims him. You can almost feel the heavy, stale air in his chambers, where candles burn not for ceremony, but to mask the stench of a body collapsing in slow motion. This is no regal passing, it is a grotesque unravelling, a man undone by his own excesses and paranoia. Courtiers creep in and out, some out of duty, others out of morbid curiosity, watching as the king drifts in and out of lucidity. He lashes out at times, demanding loyalty, accusing Maria Cristina of plotting against him, raging at physicians who cannot heal him. At other times he is strangely quiet, clutching relics and staring blankly at the walls. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand died fully aware of his failures or whether he convinced himself to the very end that he had secured his legacy through Isabella. You can almost hear the debate flicker in his mind. Triumph or humiliation, saviour or fool. Maria Cristina remains by his side, outwardly dutiful but inwardly preparing. She knows the real battles will begin the moment he dies. Already Carlist factions rally around his brother Don Carlos, insisting that a woman cannot inherit the Spanish throne. The atmosphere is thick with tension. The king is not even in his grave, and already the vultures circle. Spain itself holds its breath, wondering whether this rotting monarch will leave behind peace or civil war. A quirky tidbit emerges from these final days. Ferdinand, despite his state, still insisted on being dressed in full regal attire at times, jewels glittering on a body too weak to rise. He wanted to be remembered as a king, not a corpse in waiting. But the effect was grotesque rather than majestic, like a puppet draped in velvet, unable to disguise the truth of decay. You stand in the corner of the chamber, watching attendants adjust the crown on his swollen head, and you realise this is the ultimate irony. A man obsessed with appearances, mocked all his life for his inadequacies, ends his reign as a parody of royalty. When death finally comes in 1833, it is almost a relief. The bloated body, the paranoia, the humiliations, all collapse into silence. Yet his death is not an end, but a spark. Spain immediately fractures, plunging into the Carlist wars as factions battle over Isabella's right to rule. The legacy of Ferdinand is written not in triumphs, but in repression, humiliation, and civil strife. His reign is remembered less for what he built than for what he destroyed: freedom, stability, and the dignity of those closest to him. Historians still debate how to label him. Was Ferdinand simply inept, a weak man crushed by the weight of his role? Or was he malicious, channeling his private humiliations into public cruelty? Perhaps he was both. What is certain is that his reign left scars on Spain that would not heal quickly, and his name remains a symbol of perversion, not merely in the bedroom, but in the very way he twisted monarchy itself into an instrument of fear and humiliation. And so you step away from his deathbed, the air thick with incense, the echoes of weeping courtiers still faint in your ears. Ferdinand VII has passed, but the unease lingers as though the palace walls themselves remember his paranoia, his cruelty, and his pitiful obsessions. Spain moves forward, scarred but restless, and you carry with you the memory of a king who could never conquer his own demons, and so inflicted them on everyone else. And as the last echoes of Ferdinand's life fade, you can let the story soften in your mind. The candlelight that once flickered harshly now dims into a warm glow, steady and calm. The stench of decay, the whispers of paranoia, the endless humiliations, all of it drifts further away, like a nightmare dissolving with the morning light. What remains is distance. The king is gone, his cruelties locked in the past, and the heavy air of his chambers clears into something gentler. You can take a slow breath and another, letting your shoulders ease. Picture the palace halls, once filled with suspicion, now empty and quiet, dust settling where courtiers once fretted. The tormented boy, the bitter king, the perverse rituals, they belong to history now, not to you. You're safe here, wrapped in your own calm, your own silence. So let the story slip away, as though closing a heavy book, and step into a softer darkness. Rest easy, knowing the cruelty you've witnessed is confined to another century. And as you drift, may your dreams be lighter, your breath slower, your night more peaceful.